how do you explain the triumph of Christianity over the Roman Empire? Consider this. Around AD 30, Jesus of Nazareth was put to death by a second-tier Roman administrator in the backwater province of Judea. But some 3 centuries later, in 312, Constantine was going into battle at the Milvian Bridge with the Kairos symbol on the shields of his soldiers because he allegedly had a vision telling him, "In this sign conquer." And then later, in 380, the Emperor Theodosius II issued the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But how did this happen? How do you get from A to B? Along this line, Paula Fredrickson asks a very good question. How, over the course of 4 centuries, did one particular god end up the focus of late Roman imperial law and piety? That's a very good question, and the one we're going to explore in this video. And if you listen to the very end, I think the answer I come up with might be a little bit surprising. But anyway, how do we explain it? Well, from a theological perspective, you could simply appeal to divine providence and purpose. But even then, you've got the question of how precisely, by what material means did Christianity become so resilient and eventually hegemonic in the Roman Empire? You know, there are a lot of conspiracy theories that operate around here, especially if you check out YouTube. And one popular conspiracy theory is that Constantine made Christianity the religion of the empire so that he could use Christianity as a tool to control the people of the empire. The problem is that Constantine did no such thing. He legalized Christianity. He gave it certain privileges, a certain degree of patronage. He even tried to interfere or manage some ecclesiastical debates within the church. But otherwise, he remained completely tolerant of Jews and pagans. He didn't engage in the deliberate Christianization of the empire, nor did he really interfere in main Christian teachings. And at the end of the day, Constantine was actually unable to unify the church and keep all the bishops on a tight leash amidst the torrent of debates they were having in the Donatist and Arian controversies. So if Constantine's aim was to make Christianity the official religion and punish everyone else and to use it as a tool for propaganda and power, he kind of failed epically. I think it's important that we recognize that there were external factors, external to Christianity and the church, but inherent within the very structure of the Roman Empire that allowed Christianity to spread, flourish, and eventually become a very warranted option that a lot of people would consider and eventually develop a degree even of political clout. Okay, consider the following. The Roman Empire had created a political edifice, you know, a social system. They had a safe means of travel, and it was possible for religious ideas to spread, for networks to develop across Europe, Africa, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and elsewhere. So it was a time in European history across the Mediterranean where you've got kind of like an almost unprecedented ability for people to connect with each other and for networks and ideas to develop within the Mediterranean basin. The other thing we've got to remember is that monotheism as a concept was kind of on the rise during this period in the Greco-Roman world. Now, there are ancient forms of monotheism you can find in religions of the ancient Near East and in the Mediterranean, but they seem to be developing more and becoming more popular in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. Devotion to the Most High God was known in parts of Asia Minor in the 1st century. Middle Platonists, I should say, were floating with monotheistic notions in the 2nd century. And there were attempts to import the Syrian god El-Gabal into Rome in the early 3rd century. It didn't go particularly well then, but By the late 3rd century, emperors like Diocletian would champion the cult of Sol Invictus, the triumphant sun, as the supreme deity over all the others. So monotheism was finding more adherents, it had more purchase as a concept, and Christianity was able to ride upon that. As for another factor, perhaps Christianity was simply a more inclusive brand of Judaism. We know from Philo and Josephus about many pagans who were attracted to Judaism. Many adhered to or followed Jewish customs. Many converted to the Jewish way of life. Some even went so far as to become proselytes and to be initiated into Jewish communities. So maybe Christianity, with its Jewish heritage, was a type of Judaism light that was even more palatable to pagans, given that Christianity maintained some of the things that made Judaism interesting, like its antiquity, its monotheism, its sacred texts, its ethics, its sense of solidarity and identity. But it divested itself of some of the things within Judaism that many people found hard, like the requirement to be circumcised for men or abstaining from things like pork. It may well be the case that Christianity succeeded on the coattails of Judaism becoming the religion of the empire. An older theory as to why Christianity became predominant in the Roman Empire is offered by the great historian Edward Gibbon. He attributed the rise of Christianity to the inflexible and intolerant zeal of the early Christians. In other words, the early Christians were religious nutjobs who wouldn't shut up or give up. They were able to win over the empire by the sheer will of their fanaticism. Now, that might sound like a very convincing answer at one level. The Christians were known for their great industry and energy and their sense of mission, but you could say the same thing about almost any group. Like, why did Lenin and the communists take over Russia? Because they simply wanted it more and they were willing to do more to get it. Or why did the Ayatollah take over Iran? He wanted it more and his group was better organized and better networked and simply more fanatical about doing it. I do believe there are some better options, and one I think we should consider has recently been offered by Paula Fredrickson in her book Ancient Christianities. She argues there that what really made a strong difference was the strong institutional organization centered around the bishop that emerges clearly by the mid-3rd century. For Fredrickson, it was the church of the bishops that captured Constantine's allegiance, since bishops by that point had weathered the storm of occasional state coercion, whether through resistance, subterfuge, or acquiescence. And the bishops became the executives of a movement that cultivated a broad social reach. For my mind, the best argument supporting Fredrickson's view would be to find a parallel with the European Reformation. Why did the European Reformation become so popular in certain parts of Europe? I think there are a few instances where it was kind of top-down, but for the most part, it wasn't top-down or bottom-up. You see, from the European Revolution, we learned that new religious movements or new religious directions happen when the middle management of a kingdom or empire latches onto an idea, a trend, a movement or a network, and they then become the movers and shakers behind it to see it implemented and become part of the status quo, or to become a particular element embedded with the echelons of power and privilege within a particular kingdom or empire. Many bishops in the 3rd century were either from the elite class or were at least literary elites. Many of them were experts in rhetoric, law, and philosophy, and they simply got behind Christianity and helped make it hegemonic. But that still raises the question, doesn't it? Why did the middle managers and the intellectual class of the Roman Empire become attracted to Christianity? And I think we can go there to what Fredrickson said about its broad appeal. I do think that was a big factor. It was the broad appeal of Christianity. I think the figure of Jesus was very attractive. Jesus did have incredibly broad appeal. He was a teacher, a miracle worker, a healer. He was the Messiah. He was a savior. Now, yes, in other religions and in other philosophies, you can find miracle workers and teachers, but Jesus simply appealed more than the alternatives did. Jesus was perhaps magnetic. There was something about him in the books that became the canonical Gospels that people wanted to believe in and follow. I'm also inclined to believe as well that another important factor for Christianity's broad social appeal was that Christianity did introduce something of a moral and social revolution, introducing virtues like humility. And it resulted in things like opposition to gladiatorial contests, opposition to infanticide and abortion, championing asceticism over licentiousness. It also had an acute focus on the vulnerable and helpless. Let's remember that the pagan philosopher Celsus in the late 2nd century derided Christianity as a religion of slaves, women, and children, which is exactly why it kind of stood out. It was a religion that said God was on the side of the lowly, the despised, and the dispossessed. And yes, I know not all Christians were ethically rigorous, and they were ethically austere pagans. But the idea of slaves and masters as one in Christ, the idea that God was the champion of the poor and the conqueror of the mighty, that had a lot of appeal to people. I mean, even Julian the Apostate, who tried to bring the empire back to its pagan roots, who tried to throw off the shackles of Christianity. I mean, he became emperor and he tried to do that, but even he had to admit that by his day, the church had a practical monopoly on all the charities and the giving of alms and the helping of the poor and vulnerable. So I think Fredrickson is strongly right in that sense, but I would add one qualification to her theory. Fredrickson's way of putting it with a focus on the bishop reminds me a little bit of Walter Bauer's thesis about the origins of Christianity and heresy and orthodoxy. Bauer put a lot of emphasis on the clout of the bishops, and particularly the Roman bishops, who he says really called the shots, defined orthodoxy, and, made all the changes that really lasted. But the problem there is that I think it overemphasizes or overestimates the power of the bishops, especially the Bishop of Rome. And we've got to be careful not to read medieval notions of bishops wielding prince-like power and the magisterial papacy back into late antiquity. And that type of thing is going to happen, but it's going to happen much later. In many places, bishops struggled to maintain control of their see or their diocese. They could be easily deposed by various factions and other groups. So the bishops were not necessarily all powerful. Often they were contingent on a bunch of other factors, including whoever the emperor was, factions in the church, rivals, and the sort of will and wishes of the populace and the clergy and the laity wherever they were. We've also got to remember that Christianity did spread in places without Roman imperial sponsorship, in places like Ethiopia or Persia or Parthia, India, and even into Eurasia. And it was there, despite competition from Manichaeanism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, other local cults and deities, that the Nestorian and Monophysite Christianities gained converts and became influential in regions outside the Roman Empire. So we can't just focus our social analogy on the Roman Empire and its relation to the church. We've also got to look east a bit and look at why Christianity spread, where it went, and how it was able to survive, what kind of support it got from local rulers and the like. Indeed, we can note that there were several Christian dioceses between Baghdad and Beijing by the year 1000, and Christian universities sprang up in areas of northern Iraq and Persia over the next half millennium. So we shouldn't be narrowly focused on the Bishop of Rome and the power of the bishops themselves, which I think is a little bit more contestable. So at the end of the day, I think Fredrickson here is generally correct. And you can look at the Christianization of the Roman Empire and compare it with the growth of the Reformation in Northern Europe and see an analogy whereby it's the middle managers who really are the ones who precipitate change and become the ones who get behind some kind of idea and a religious revolution that finds purchase and takes shape. The qualifications I want to make is we shouldn't overemphasize the authority, power, and influence of any bishop, certainly not the Bishop of Rome, and we've got to be mindful of how and why Christianity spread outside the theater of the Roman Empire. But all the hypotheses aside, when it comes to telling the story of how Christianity took over the empire, I can't but help go to a famous quote from Durant. I just think this is a great quote. This is what Durant said. He said, "There is no greater drama in human record than the sight of a few oppressed Christians, scorned or oppressed by a succession of emperors, bearing all trials with a fierce tenacity, multiplying quietly, building order while their enemies generated chaos, fighting the sword with the word, brutality with hope, and at last defeating the strongest state that history has known. Caesar and Christ had met in the arena, and Christ had won." Now, that quote engages in gross generalizations. You can contest certain aspects of it, but there is at least a kernel of truth in it. You know, think of Jesus crucified by Pontius Pilate. Many of the apostles, according to tradition, crucified or beheaded. You know, Christians hiding in catacombs or caves, or on some occasions being thrown to the lions. This was not a religion you would necessarily have backed in the first century to become the religion of the empire. But by the 4th century, it does. And telling that story, I think, is truly fascinating. But what about you? Why do you think Christianity succeeded in taking over the Roman Empire? Let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Hey, thanks for watching this episode of Early Christian History. Hope you liked this video on how Christianity took over the Roman Empire. If you like this video, you can find a lot of similar content on the channel. I've got videos about Christology, political theology, how to read the Bible, a little bit of Anglicanism thrown in for good measure as well. So check out the channel, see what you find, and I hope to see you on the next episode of Early Christian History.